Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to speak about a prize that I really look forward to every year. It's the Goldsmiths prize. And what this essentially looks at is innovative fiction in whatever form that kind of takes. And so you often get basically very different sort of ways of approaching the novel that come out in this. A couple of years ago, I did a sort of look back over the 10 years of the prize. I think we're now on year 12 of it. And what has been really interesting to see from all of the winners and sort of shortlisted novels over that time has just been the sheer variety in what a novel can be. And so you've got novels that are written in a sort of stream of consciousness or kind of more ambitious style. You've got novels that break up the page and sort of do interesting things with the physicality of the book. You've got books that sort of subvert the very idea of how a novel should be done, in terms of inverting ideas around plot or around various other things. And it's just really exciting to see basically how books can be so different and how many authors are working in the field of writing and kind of contributing new ideas to sort of morphing what a novel can be. And so with that in mind, I wanted to talk about the books that have been shortlisted for this year's prize, and I've just finished reading them. So let's get talking a little bit about them. So first up, we have Mark Bowles with All My Precious Madness. And this is a wild ride of a book in many ways. The Goldsmiths Prize is no sort of stranger to having titles from Galley-Beggar Press. And I think a couple of winners at least have been from there. And this is just a really fun book, but in a slightly offbeat kind of way. The narrator of this book is a deeply bitter and angry man. In many ways, he spends so much of the book kind of decrying various people who he hates or situations he hates. And it, in theory, could be a book that would sort of drag you into its misery as well. But there's something oddly funny at the heart of it. It's a very black, dark sense of humour of just this character who is basically looking back over past traumas and past things in his life. And is telling himself that everything's going to be different, but is also very much like, well, screw this person and screw that person, blah, blah, blah. But actually at the heart of it, a sort of a more standard story is still being told of this man sort of going through parts of his life, all while interspersed with other things. So he talks a lot about sort of philosophy and theory, and particularly sort of like critical theory. And so there are various parts where he's at university talking about Deleuze, or talking about, this is now where I forget any other theorists' names, but he basically starts talking about critical theories. And he also, in doing so, exposes himself as this sort of kind of anti-hero figure, where, he'll go into situations like, be part of philosophical discussions or university discussions, and he will sort of shoot down the sacred cows of their theory, right? He'll say this thing actually doesn't make sense, or what does that really practically mean in a life? And so in some ways this book feels like a critique of something like kind of over intellectualizing things. Meanwhile, he's also a fan of theories and various other things, but he sort of is quite happy to take aim at the kind of preposterousness of the sort of university sphere, whilst acknowledging that he's part of it. And the book, without spoiling anything, the book towards the end especially starts playing with some of these ideas that, yes, he can over intellectualize all of these things as much as he wants, but also, are these things that his father would understand in his final moments? And actually, is it more important in those final moments to just be able to say things about how much you love someone, or to be able to have these other conversations? And so it's kind of interesting because the book almost uses and weaponizes critical theory to denounce critical theory, and it also uses the sort of boisterous kind of sullen figure at the kind of heart of this book to also decry the kind of sullenness of sort of going through life. So it kind of is it's a book that is almost overly self-conscious, but almost under self-conscious at the same time. And I just found it really fun and engaging for that reason. Next up, Tell by Jonathan Buckley by Fitzcarraldo Press, another press who feature quite prominently in a lot of Goldsmiths prize lists as well, and have had a winner or two at least in that as well. And actually it's worth noting, you'll see that so many of the books I'm talking about in this shortlist are indie authors, or indie presses rather, and that's actually a really brilliant thing I think about the Goldsmiths, is because it's a prize that champions books that are kind of slightly off, sort of left field and slightly, different in that way. Those are often the books that are picked up by indie presses because those are the kind of risks that indie presses take. So anyway, Tell by Jonathan Buckley is told through a series of recordings of an interview. And these are interviewed portions for basically someone having gone missing, and it's someone who used to work for him as a gardener who is telling her side of the story. And in doing so, we sort of slowly unpick the real story of what's happening by almost reading between the lines. But there's also something where the author is then allowed this ability to hide certain information almost in plain sight, because the character will say something and we just sort of take it as given, but also maybe you might want to distrust some things. There are also parts of the transcript that are inaudible, and so that's sort of marked off. And so sometimes we kind of end mid-sentence and then pick up somewhere else. And through doing so, we kind of get a sense of this sort of what is a real story, what is being hidden, what's not being told. And I covered this recently in a Weekly Reads video and mentioned a video game that this reminds me of, a game called Her Story, which is also told through sort of recordings of interviews. It's not as a transcript as with this, but the idea is still similar, where you are searching for text to kind of reconstruct a story. And to some degree, Tell plays on that same idea of actually what does a narrative look like if we're only hearing a narrative through someone's point of view. We're not, obviously so often novels are told in the first person where we're in someone's head, but we hear them complete thoughts. Whereas here we're hearing someone presenting their version of the truth and occasionally being cut off, or occasionally having to come back another day to do a second batch of recording, in which time they're allowed to essentially reformulate how they might tell a story. And so I think this book is really interesting for how it plays with that very idea of what it means to have a narrative, what it means to construct a story, and what is real and what's not. Next up, an author who I think previous to this was already the most shortlisted in this prize's history and continues that streak, Rachel Cusk with Parade. And so I've only read a couple of Rachel Cusk books, and I've been between opinions on various ones. I really loved her memoir about motherhood. It was quite a controversial one, but I think it's really interestingly written. I struggled a bit with Second Place, and I actually got on a bit better, I think, with Parade. And Parade, in many ways, sort of, I suppose, fits on this list and the kind of view of innovative fiction by the way that it tells certain stories, where we are particularly looking through the eyes of certain artists. It's like with many Rachel Cusk books, it is kind of really obsessed or kind of preoccupied with the idea of art and art history and the ways that art reflects how we think about ourselves, and particularly women and art. And we see in this book how sort of there's almost a shifting narrative. At times we realize that the letter that we're being presented with for these, I think it's G if I remember correctly now, that we're being given to represent these artists, we realize is actually a changing figure. Because at first I got really confused when by the second or third person being referenced, this person had been a black woman and a white gay man, I think, or something. And I was like, okay, I'm missing something here, and realized what was happening. But she sort of interweaves rather parts of this book with various different characters, and they are almost to some degree stripped of their identity, but then given by kind of replacing their name with a letter. But in some ways they are then all sort of bound together to sort of speak about representations of art and various other things. I won't claim to fully understand what was happening in this novel, but I did enjoy the kind of thrust of it. I liked the intelligent conversations it was having about art and art history. I thought the narrative, the use for the narrative of having these different interweaving voices, and particularly what they were saying about representation and art, I thought was really interesting. And definitely in very Rachel Cusk fashion is a novel that is intentionally challenging and I think probing about certain questions, and isn't there to provide a neat narrative that's, you know, like a really enjoyable love story, right? It's, you know, Rachel Cusk intentionally is sort of seeking out these more complicated narratives and these more complicated discussions. And even if I don't necessarily understand what's happening with Rachel Cusk's book, there is something where I feel she's going somewhere and she has an idea and a thesis in mind. And I think that's definitely true for this one. Next up, we have Choice by Neel Mukherjee. And I read this book earlier in the year, and it is, I can totally see why it's on this list. I hadn't actually thought of it as a potential for this, but yeah, absolutely makes sense. It's a novel that is told as almost three, I won't call them, to some degree, they're short stories, or almost novellas, and they interlink sort of, but also not. And in some ways, I think right from the beginning, then Neel Mukherjee is kind of playing with the reader in terms of our expectations of a narrative, because although there are lines that can be drawn between the three parts that maybe connect them, there's some kind of connective tissue between the three. They are almost standalone in a way that almost feels like it's intentionally confounding the reader's expectations of joint narratives, but at the same time plays with some of the same key themes. So what we see is sort of three parts, and you know, most reviewers that I've seen are kind of talking about it, because this is sort of how I felt a bit as well. I found them slightly uneven in terms of my enjoyment of them, but there is something interesting about the way they intersect. So the first part is a publisher who is compiling some works. We have another person who is, it's sort of an academic, and there are various people in her life, and these new things have kind of been welcome into her life. There's a sort of a massive change in circumstances, and everything else changes from that. And the third part is a rural village where a gift is given to them, and it upends everything. And so although there's some connective tissue already about this idea of, you know, some of the core story tropes of everything is fine until something new comes in and then everything's not fine, there is a way there's a way that almost the first part of this book, by setting out to be about telling other stories, feels like it's almost this home world for exploring this other part, right? Of well, if we're collecting other stories, then actually here's another story that I can tell you, and then here's another one, and how do they all link up, and all these sorts of things. So it's quite a strange book at times, because I think with each new part you read, there is some element of, okay, so what's actually happening here? And I think something about being unsettled in that way is really interesting, because this book does, like with Rachel Cusk, have a real thesis for where it's going. It feels like it has a lot to say about kind of the state of the world, and kind of it links into a few things around sort of empire and kind of colonialism, and talks in kind of broader terms around some of those. But it also has this sort of very, every sort of single story feels like it's very hyper focused on this one world of where it is, and so the reader is almost being invited to draw the lines between them. There's almost something about the juxtaposition of putting the three books, or the three parts, next to each other, that sort of says, well, actually you do some of the work now, how are they connected? And there's something quite interesting, I think, for me about that, about what it sort of says in terms of reader agency and trusting the reader to draw some of these lines and to make some of these connections as well. Next up, we have Spent Light by Lara, Pawson. And this is just an absolutely balmy book. I covered it recently in my weekly reads. It's a book I really loved, and again, can't really tell you what it was about, but it was a really fun ride. It feels at times like it shouldn't make sense, but it absolutely does, and I don't know how. So it all starts with somebody, with a woman clearing through bits of her house and sort of looking at some of the items, and particularly there's a sort of a toaster that sort of spins off everything else. And from there, she then starts to unpack and unpick various bits of her life. So she starts going off on tangents about war or empire, and then she goes off on this other tangent about something very domestic, and then she goes off about something else, and all of these kind of are connected with things in her house, but also not. And kind of like with Ducks Newburyport, which I love dearly, the what appear to be random rambles eventually connect back in some capacity. So at one point she'll mention something and then 20 pages later we're actually back to that thing, and it's, well, actually this this soldier in this war, and there was this general, and then we're going to talk over here a bit, so then back to the Congo, blah blah blah. It's sort of, where are we going? And for such a short book, it does so much. There are so many little levels and layers and things going on. I loved it. I can't tell you why or what it was about, but I really enjoyed this. And I think this, again, feels very much like the Goldsmiths kind of style, because it is just a book that defies typical sort of categorization. You could put it in a bookshop under fiction, but then people would pick it up and be like, what is this? But it's not non-fiction, and it's a very specific type of fiction, but who knows what it is. And it's just this wild book and this wild ride, and I really enjoyed it. I just think this is a really fun piece of writing, and it's interesting as well, because there's a bookshop relatively local to me where a bookseller has been really big on pushing this book, and what sort of happened is quite a few people have read it and kind of come back with basically a similar thing to me, of being like, this is brilliant, this is genius. What is it? I don't know, but it's great. And so, but I think all of that makes it sound like this book is a lot more random than it is, but there's a careful construction going on that I think also shows that this book is so detailed and thought out, that there are, again, there's a thesis, there's a real point of where this book wants to go, and I really love how it takes you there on that journey. And last but not least, Portraits at the Palace of Creativity and Wrecking. So I had to look at my notes just to know what the title was, because it's quite a long one, by Han Smith. And this is another one that, again, wild ride. It's a book that kind of creates its own language, or its own sort of shorthand for its characters. So quite early into the book, we are introduced to various people, and particularly it has a sort of folkloric quality where we are hearing about particularly a young woman and sort of various people around her as they sort of unravel bits of family history and sort of wider socio-political history and all of these other things. So again, the sort of personhood and statehood and identity and place and belonging are all brought into the mix, sometimes thrown against each other, sometimes with each other. It does a lot. It's moving in various interesting ways. But in terms of what I was saying about it creating its own shorthand, we have a character who is, and this is now where I'm really annoyed that I gave away my copy, because I really want to refer back to this. It's someone who's referred to like something like the shadow of a something, or something along those lines. And that title slowly grows as the book goes. There's a moment where it shifts and the character gains an extra sort of shadow or whatever it was to their name. I think it's Ghost, maybe. It might be Ghost. And it's this wild freewheeling book that reminds me of just why I love reading fiction, and particularly weird fiction, because sometimes this kind of experimental stuff really throws out kind of some interesting things. And particularly, I think it really plays with what a novel can be. We have a sort of set of expectations as readers for how a plot progresses, and you often see with various reviews of people from books that say, well, actually I really love this thing, but I really wish the book did more of this, or I really wish there was a little bit more of this thing going on. I wanted to see this resolution for the characters, and that's not always possible, and I really love that this book does that. And so those are the 6 books shortlisted for the prize. And as you can tell, I really enjoyed this. I think every year, pretty much, with the Goldsmiths, I really enjoy them. And even if it's a book I don't enjoy as such, I really appreciate what it's doing, because I think there's often something really creative and interesting happening. And yeah, same again with this year. I'd love to, once I'm finished with my Booker project, to go back and read them all. But, I don't really need another project right now. But this has been a really interesting set of 6 books to read. I think my personal favourites, as you can probably tell from how I was talking about them, would probably be either All My Precious Madness by Mark Bowles, or Lara Pawson's Spent Light. I just think both are wildly inventive, but I'd love to see Han Smith's book take that as well. Jonathan Buckley's Tell, I think, is really great. And even though I didn't maybe fully understand Choice or Parade as much in the same way, I still think they're doing really exciting things with how we approach fiction. So I think this, as a group of 6 books, is a really strong list. And yeah, you know, if any of them sound interesting, I'd recommend you check them out. Most of them are pretty short as well, which actually is sometimes a nice thing with experimental books, is they're relatively short because they have a very tight focus on how they want to deliver something. And so you get these really inventive books that you can just sort of pick up and really engage with and play with and think about. And it doesn't feel as much like a slog, really. Anyway, I've been Bod Booker. I don't know why I got confused at who I was for a second there. I've been Bod Booker. Talking about the Goldsmiths prize, I will find out a winner. I think in I want to say it's the 12th of November or thereabouts. It's sort of mid-ish November. But until then, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.